Today, we're going to be talking about our next lecture, looking at the Great Depression, and finally moving towards the outbreak of World War II and America's role in that conflict. And to do that, we are going to take some time to talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president that would serve an unprecedented 4 terms as president, and he would serve for 13 years. Now, you might notice a disparity between 4 terms and the amount of years that he served, and of course, that's because Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away very shortly into his final term. But he's elected president 4 times, and he is the only president to have been elected more than 2 times. All other presidents had only been elected twice. And we'll talk about whether that was the right or wrong thing near the end of this lecture. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to fundamentally transform the United States. And in fact, I think it would be accurate to say that the United States is wholly different after Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency in many good ways, and in my opinion, in some bad ways. And I will kind of let the cat out of the bag now and say that the main way that FDR is going to change America for the worst is he is going to massively increase the size of the government. Woodrow Wilson had already done this to a limited extent, as had Herbert Hoover, but FDR is going to fundamentally change all of that. He is going to radically expand the government, and he's going to radically expand the reach of the government into the everyday lives of Americans. And the reason that FDR did this was for relief from the Great Depression. He saw the failures of his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, and the public opinion of Hoover and his lack of caring about Americans, and FDR decided that that was not going to be him. And so he is going to have many initiatives that he attempts to do to kind of fix the problem. And again, does he fix the problem? Well, that certainly is up for debate. Again, I would say that no one can fix the problem of the Great Depression. In fact, World War II is really the only thing that does that. But FDR certainly tried. And we can at least give him credit for trying a huge variety of things and really being quite successful with those. Now, first off, let's address the name Roosevelt, because of course we understand that that name is shared with Teddy Roosevelt, and I think that most of us are probably aware that FDR and Teddy Roosevelt are cousins, but they are not close cousins. They are in fact fifth cousins, and in fact we could almost think of them as from different branches of the same family. FDR certainly was not close to his cousin Teddy Roosevelt, although they were familiar with each other. And actually, FDR did serve in government at the same time as Teddy Roosevelt did, even though he was younger. He actually served as Secretary of the Navy for a few years under President Teddy Roosevelt. So they did have some connections, but they weren't necessarily close. It wasn't as if they hung out with each other all the time or anything like that. So that's important to keep in mind, that the two Roosevelts, while they were familiar with each other, they weren't necessarily particularly close. Not that they didn't like each other, they just weren't close. Roosevelt was born in upstate New York, and he attended law school. That was his profession. He was a lawyer, although I think it was clear from even an early age that FDR intended to move into politics. That's where he wanted to go with his law degree. He married a woman by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt. Actually, she was also his fifth cousin in a different direction from Teddy. Teddy did actually have a little bit of a closer relationship with Eleanor than he did with Franklin, and they married and would eventually go on to have 6 children. 5 of whom would survive into adulthood. So again, kind of ironic that he and his cousin Teddy had the same number of children. I always think that's kind of quite interesting. Now, FDR's early life is probably most famous for 2 things. Number one, that he had a number of affairs, which isn't necessarily a positive thing. But the number 2 thing is that he suffered from a very serious disease. And of course, this is probably what he's most famous for from a physical perspective, certainly. And that is the disease polio. So the disease polio affects your ability to walk, among a huge variety of things. It's not an ongoing condition per se. I think some people think that like he always had a disease, like he was coughing all the time or something like that. Polio actually is a bout of disease that you tend to get, and you have it once and then you are done, but it can do some catastrophic permanent damage. And that's exactly what happened with FDR. He lost almost complete use of his legs, although he could walk. This surprises many people. And in fact, there are several occasions in which FDR decided to walk places rather than be pushed in wheelchair. Now, to do this, however, he needed to wear these huge, heavy, and uncomfortable iron frames that surrounded the entirety of his legs. So if you ever see a picture of FDR standing up and delivering a speech, and there are several, those are real pictures, but he is in this very uncomfortable metal frame that supported his legs. And he could kind of stump around with these frames around his legs to walk places. So he was not completely paralyzed, as many people seem to believe, but he certainly was not doing well in his lower body health. His legs were certainly not in good condition because of that polio disease. It had done nerve damage to him, and there was really no recovering from it. And of course, today, polio is almost entirely eliminated as a disease. Although there are still cases of it in certain parts of the world. It's another disease that we're really trying to wipe out, like smallpox, but that has not happened yet. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to run for president shortly after the Great Depression occurred because he had some serious success in New York, where Hoover had not had success nationally. In fact, by 1930 and 1931 in New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had already introduced a number of programs and projects that had seemed to assist New Yorkers in what they were attempting to do. And so by doing so, as governor of New York from 1929 to 1932, FDR had enormous success and he was enormously popular. It seemed like he was always out doing things, and admittedly, not all of his attempts to help the people in the economy worked, but he certainly was seen to be active, and he cared about the average American, which, by the way, is ironic because FDR was independently wealthy. He really came from a upper wealthy class, whereas Herbert Hoover had kind of crawled his way up from the bottom, and yet people thought of FDR as much closer to them than they did of Herbert Hoover. And I think that has a lot to do with the personality of these two men. Herbert Hoover, again, as I mentioned last lecture, always thought he was the smartest man in the room, whereas FDR, while he was incredibly intelligent, had a much more down-to-earth personality. In fact, he has a very warm speaking style. In fact, you can actually log onto YouTube right now and you can listen to a number of FDR speeches, sometimes called his fireside chats, and he's just very homey. He sounds like somebody's grandfather just talking in a very slow and settled way. And I think this really assisted Roosevelt in his popularity. People really felt like they had a connection with him that made him very electable. And again, as I mentioned last time, in the 1932 presidential election, not only did he win, but he won by a landslide. Herbert Hoover was absolutely beaten, and FDR rode into the White House on a huge wave of public support. Now, immediately, as soon as FDR was sworn in March of 1933, he began to put in place the programs that he had been designing to deal with depression. This is called the 100 Days. And in fact, every president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt has kind of been judged on the standard of what they accomplish in their first 100 days. In fact, FDR still holds the gold standard for how much he got done. Dozens of bills passed very, very quickly, huge, wide-ranging bills. By the way, one of the reasons that FDR was able to do this was for the first time in almost 50 years, both House and Senate of the United States were controlled by Democrats. And so FDR was able to pass a number of measures basically without opposition. And not only were the House and the Senate controlled by Democrats, but I believe that they were controlled by a two-thirds majority of Democrats, meaning that there was no possible way for the Republicans to overrule them. And in fact, as these programs are rolled out under FDR, there's actually only one branch of government that can even slow FDR down, and that is the judiciary, or the Supreme Court. And we will talk about them and how they did several things to thwart FDR shortly. FDR is going to begin to bring about a process that is sometimes called the alphabet soup, but it could also be called the New Deal, which is what FDR actually himself called it. He announced in speeches, even before he became president, that he was going to make a new deal for America. And this new deal was going to be a comprehensive series of economic reforms that was going to do everything from give relief to the poor to create new federal divisions that were going to hopefully create jobs, a network of approved goods that were going to continue the economic growth and everything else that is being done. So FDR has this New Deal plan. And under the New Deal, the United States is going to be transformed relatively quickly, and it's going to be transformed really in several major and important ways. And again, the New Deal involves a whole bunch of new government agencies. And again, this is the part of it that's oftentimes referred to as alphabet soup. If you've ever eaten alphabet soup, maybe some Campbell's soup with little noodles shaped like letters in your little tomato soup there. If you just kind of put a spoonful in and you pull up some letters and you read those letters off, that's kind of what the government programs that FDR put into place were. So we have things like the FARA, okay, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. We have the PWA, the Public Works Administration. We have the CCC, my personal favorite, the Civilian Conservation Corps. We have the RFC. We have the FDC. We have the AAA or AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And we have the NIRA, the National Industry Recovery Act. So you can kind of see why we kind of give it this moniker, alphabet soup. It's just all of these acronyms. And by the way, if you were in a college level class, you'd probably have to learn all those acronyms. I certainly did when I studied this period. Fortunately for you, you don't have to worry about that for a test or anything like that. Just know there were all of these organizations put together by FDR. And I wish we had time to get into all of them. I think each division and thing that FDR did is fairly important, sometimes because it was really helpful for America, sometimes because it causes us problems up to this day, but we simply don't have time. So let me use the CCC, my personal favorite of these programs, to kind of illustrate what the purpose of FDR's programs were. The Civilian Conservation Corps was an opportunity for young men to get a job and earn an income that would help support their family. To do this, FDR decided to spend massively on improving the recreational infrastructure of the United States. What is recreational infrastructure, you might ask? Well, that is your local park, or your national park, or your state park. Any of these things are part of the things that the CCC would be doing. So what the CCC did is it would take young men and it would take them and it would house them. It would give them a very small paycheck every week, and it would pay for absolutely everything else that they ate, they did, they wore, and they would work and they would build. They would clear trails. They would build bridges across lakes and across marshlands. They would basically create every national park trail system that you are familiar with. In fact, if you go hiking at any point during this quarantine period, it's likely that you have actually walked on a trail originally blazed by these CCC workers. And they would do this, and at the end of their term, usually they were signed up for 3, 6, or 1 year long terms, they would go home and they would be basically given a lump sum of money. Effectively, they had been taken out of the economy, but they were still being paid and they were still doing useful work. And so by doing so, not only did they improve the United States, but theoretically they improve the economic situation of the United States. By the way, the CCC is also particularly important, and Roosevelt could not possibly have known this when he designed the program, but certainly it paid off in that it created a large number of active and easy recruits for the United States Armed Forces in World War II. A number of men that served on the CCC came back during World War II to serve as officers and as soldiers in the United States Army. And the engineering skills that they had developed building these national park systems and these state park systems have really helped them when they were in combat and had to get across a marshy piece of land. They might build a bridge quickly to get them and their men across and do different things like this. So really quite an interesting process. Another important thing that FDR is going to do is he is going to institute a program called Social Security. Now this, by the way, idea starts in 1936, but it does not really come to fruition until 1938, 1939. The problem that the United States faced was that as people got older, they did not really have an incentive to leave the workforce. That means that people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, if they were not very wise with their money and laid it away, they would have to continue to work to continue to live. And the problem is that they would hold down jobs. And as people came into the economy, as people graduated from high school or graduated from college and wanted to get into working, they couldn't because these jobs were held by older people. And especially as unemployment rose in the Great Depression, in fact, unemployment in the Great Depression reached 25%. 1 out of every 4 adults in the United States was looking for work and could not find it. This became a serious problem. Many people in the United States began to advocate for some kind of care for the elderly so they could leave the workforce And that would then do two things. Number one, it would open up new jobs for young people. That is an advantage for young people. Number two, it would basically create more money that would be spent by the older people into the economy. Remember that old strategy where we're going to give money to the companies are going to pay employees, the employees are going to buy things. Instead, this time we're going to pay the old people, and the old people are going to use their money to keep the economy going. The actuality is this actually does work, because old people, if they're relying on their Social Security payments, don't tend to save that money. They tend to spend it. And if they're getting Social Security but are already wealthy, they don't tend to save that money either. They tend to spend that money and put it back into the economy. So this actually works. By giving the older people money, by removing them from the workforce, they continue to give them a salary so they can live. That salary gets put back into the economy. The old folks are buying food, they're buying gas, they're buying furniture, and those jobs open up for young people who can then do the same thing with their families. And so we have this really nice system. The problem is that the government is really, really bad at redistributing the money. Theoretically, the purpose of Social Security is to take some of the money from every income check that you ever receive. So if you ever work, or if you are working now, the government takes part of the money you earn and it puts it towards your Social Security. So theoretically, how this works in theory is the government takes your money and it puts it into a savings account. And it does that throughout your entire life. So by the end of your life, when you retire, you are basically paid from the money that you paid in. The problem is the government is inefficient, and there are people that are employed by the Social Security Office, and the Social Security Office provides Social Security to people that did not pay very much into the program. And at the end of the day, what actually happens is rather than put that money in a savings account and sit on it, the government actually takes that money and pays the current old people. So every dollar that gets taken out of your paycheck will pay for somebody who's currently on retirement. The problem with this is that eventually there will be too many old people for Social Security to support. And then the program will have to shut down. And then suddenly you have had money taken out of your paycheck for your entire life, and you don't have Social Security to enjoy. Now, I'm not saying that to say doom and gloom, be very afraid, but Social Security is something that is a problem. And while FDR didn't expect this problem to occur, anyone who could do some quick math on the back of a napkin could have told him that this problem would have eventually occurred. And so by doing this, he created one of the biggest economic problems in American history. By the way, the Social Security payments that the United States make account for almost 40% of the U.S. federal budget. Okay, so senators and representatives are fighting over the defense budget, which is very large, but the defense budget is tiny in comparison to what we spend on supporting people on Social Security. So it's a problem. And again, that's not because Social Security is wrong. It's not because supporting old people is wrong. I like old people. I hope they continue to get the money they need to live and things like that. But the problem is Social Security as it's designed now, very problematic. And that problem will continue to get worse from the days of FDR all the way on to our times. Another thing that FDR is going to do particularly well is he is going to appeal to the average American. And not only through his personality, but I do want to talk about his ability to speak to all Americans. Remember back when we talked about the Roaring 20s, almost every American family had access to the radio. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt used the radio to communicate to Americans. And this was the first time that this was done. Herbert Hoover had made a few addresses on the radio, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually spoke on the radio on a regular basis. He would speak and he would communicate with the people that were around. He would communicate with all of the Americans that lived in the United States, and he would deliver messages. His most famous message that I'm aware of is his message about the bank runs. In early 1933, around the time that he became president, there was a bank run in the United States. And again, if you're not familiar with the bank run, you should watch the movie It's a Wonderful Life. And remember, this is where everybody goes to the bank and demands all of their money out. And the way banks work is that banks take your money and they take 90% of that money and they give it back out in the form of loans. And so a vast majority of the money in the bank is not actually physically in the bank. In fact, less than 10% is on a normal basis. So if absolutely everybody came back and demanded their money, the bank has two options. Number one, it has to say, I don't have your money. It doesn't exist. Or number two, it has to call in every debt it owns. So, Sally, you're going to have to pay your entire house bill off. I can't do that. Oh, well, I'm sorry. You're now homeless. I'm kicking you out. And I'm going to have to sell that house. When I finally get the house sold, now I've got cash. And now I can take that cash and I can give it to the people that are demanding their money. And of course, you can quickly see that this creates a cascade problem. As soon as somebody's starting to call in their debts, everybody else is calling in their debts. And we just have a huge and really unrestrainable problem that's going on. And again, the movie It's a Wonderful Life illustrates this extremely well. Franklin Delano Roosevelt really took control of this bank run, and he almost eliminated it overnight. He got on the radio and he said, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to shut down banks. We're going to give them a bank holiday. No one's allowed to go get their cash out of the banks. And what's going to happen is the banks are going to reopen. But when they reopen, they are going to be insured by the federal government. What does insurance from the federal government mean? Well, that means that if people come in demanding their money, the federal government is going to step in and it is going to allow the bank to pay off all of those dollars. And you might ask, how can they do that? Well, they actually sell the bank basically something. They sell them cash. And how do they do that? They actually take bonds that the bank owns and they take possession of them. And by taking possession of them, they then move money into the bank's accounts, and the bank can then use that money to pay off their borrowers or their lenders, the people that put money in the bank. And the government's not going to ask for that money back. Now, it does need to be repaid. Don't get me wrong. This is not money for free. It's not like go around the Monopoly board, here's $200. This is a loan. We have given you money and we've taken something of yours that you need to get back eventually, but the government's also not going to call them up and say, hey, bank, we need our money right now, and if you can't pay, we're going to take everything you own, right? So the government kind of steps in and it begins fixing the problem. And again, this is something that FDR is really good at. He's really good at being active and taking action. Okay, he's not sitting around. It looks like he's really helping Americans, and I think he really was helping Americans. He was trying to help Americans. Again, the problems come when you realize that FDR's attempts to help sometimes caused more problems than they solved. And many of those problems were not apparent when FDR was in office. They became apparent in the 1950s and 60s, 70s, and 80s, and really began to cause problems at those times. Now, the biggest barrier to FDR's early legislation, the New Deal and the second New Deal that he was putting together after the first one helped, but it did not fix the problem, was a group of men known as the Four Horsemen. The Four Horsemen are the four figures in the book of Revelation that kind of ride down the first major judgments of God during the tribulation. They have been written about in medieval European mythology. We have pestilence, war, death, ruin. These are just some of the names that they're given. Obviously, go and read the Bible. They talk about these four figures on these four horses that are in the book of Revelation. Now, these particular men were called the Four Horsemen not because they brought actual disasters, but because they seemed to knock down and obliterate everything that FDR attempted to do. These four guys were four conservative justices on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, of course, as I'm sure you're aware of by this point in American history, has 9 sitting justices. There were 4 liberal justices. There was a Chief Justice who was definitely conservative leaning, and there were 4 arch-conservative justices who would really not allow any of FDR's new legislation. And so every time FDR would attempt to create a new organization, what the Four Horsemen would do is they would strike the law down as unconstitutional. And almost always the Chief Justice would vote with them, and we would have a 5-4 vote, and FDR would lose. And he lost again and again and again and again and again in court, and it was driving him nuts. To give you an example of how this worked, let's talk about the AAA, the AAA, the Agricultural Administration Organization. Oh, excuse me, that is not correct. Let me look up what it's actually called. Okay, we have the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. I was close. I tried. Organization doesn't start with an A, for those of you who are paying attention. Okay, so let's talk about the AAA. So AAA basically was this program that was designed to save those poor farmers that we talked about a couple lectures ago who had serious problems. Remember, they were out competing each other. They were producing so much food that the prices were going down into the basement. And if you stopped producing as much food, then your neighbor produced more and you were still toast. And it just caused all of these problems. The AAA was basically an agreement between the farmers that you aren't going to produce that much food. Well, how can we get you not to produce food? Well, the government said this: look, Farmer Joe, you have 5 fields. We are going to pay you $1,000 per field that you do not farm. So Farmer Joe goes, oh, wow, I can get guaranteed money for not farming my field. Now, when I usually introduce this idea, most people go, wait a second, that does not make sense. The government is paying people to not farm. And that is correct. The reason the government is doing this is by paying Farmer Joe $1,000 per field he doesn't farm, he's probably just going to farm the one field. Okay, he's going to take his $4,000, easy money. He literally did do nothing. He just got the money. He's going to farm his one field. But by doing that, not only does he have crops to sell, but because there's less food on the market, the value of those crops is much higher. And when he sells those crops, he's actually probably going to make a profit just with that field. And then he gets the extra $4,000 from his other fields. And every farmer in the United States is now doing this. And so rather than having these massive surpluses of food, we actually have a correct amount of food and the prices are right and the farmers kind of get relief. The problem is that this is unconstitutional. In fact, the Supreme Court knocks it down because they ask what role the federal government could possibly have in regulating the farming practices in an individual state. And by the way, this is true. The federal government technically only has the power to intervene in economic matters that involve interstate commerce. That means goods that are traveling across state lines. And the Supreme Court said a vast majority of farmers are producing goods that are eaten in the local area. Okay, so Farmer Joe doesn't ship his goods to California if he lives in Michigan. He serves people in Michigan. And they were right. And because of this, they struck it down. And the AAA program had to be stopped. Now, the reality is that in the moment, I definitely see why FDR did this. And in fact, it is actually still the policy of the United States government today. Eventually, a new AAA organization was created, and that organization was declared to be constitutionally valid by making a couple small changes in 1937 and 1938. So the Supreme Court allowed it later on. But this was the kind of problem that FDR had. The Supreme Court justices would strike down his ideas no matter what they were. This led FDR to do probably the most politically unpopular thing he did in his entire presidency. He began to suggest, excuse me, I promise, not corona. He began to suggest that the solution to this problem that he had was to introduce more Supreme Court justices. The way he decided to do this was he began to criticize the Supreme Court justices for being too old. In fact, the vast majority of them were over 70 years old. And what he suggested is that for each 70-year-old justice, a new justice ought to be appointed by none other than himself, of course, since he was the president, and that when the 70-year-old justice retired, that position would not be filled. So effectively, for every 70-year-old justice, a new Supreme Court justice would be added. If he had done this in 1936 when he first proposed the idea, this would have made a court of 13, which means 4 additional liberal justices, and the court would have always voted liberal rather than conservative. This received wide-scale backlash. Many people rejected this idea as an attempt by the president to take the judiciary's power for himself, and he was loudly ridiculed for this. He did win re-election, but he was not as popular as he had been. He actually damaged his political campaign by suggesting this. But ironically, it didn't matter, because after the 1937 election, the Chief Justice, seeing that the American people had voted for FDR overwhelmingly again, despite the fact that he had put all of these programs into place, decided that he was going to listen to the people and begin voting with the liberal justices. So before we have a bunch of decisions going against the government 5-4, after the 1937 election, we have elections going for the government 5-4. Okay, so they were against 5-4, now they're for 5-4. The 4 horsemen didn't change sides. They were still opposed to FDR, but that central justice, the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, he switched sides. And so now all of these cases are going to go through the Supreme Court and FDR is going to win. All of that being said, and I know that was a lot of information on FDR, by 1937, the Depression was still going. And in fact, if we look at the economic legacy of FDR, had his presidency ended in 1939 or 1940, we might not be able to say that FDR had beaten the Depression. In fact, while we were slowly coming up, we certainly were not growing very quickly. And in fact, many people have referred to the end of the Depression as a recession. The economy simply was stagnant, it wasn't moving. But of course, at the end of the day, 1941 was going to roll around, and FDR's programs were going to perfectly position the United States to become the world's leading industrial power. And we're going to leverage that industrial power to produce massive amounts of war material for the Allies. And we're going to effectively win World War II through our ability to produce. Between the United States and the Soviet Union's incredible industrial potential, we are simply going to outproduce our enemies and produce more planes, tanks, bombs, and guns than they could ever possibly deal with. And we'll talk about that when we get into World War II itself. Now, the next lecture is not an American history lecture, despite the fact that we need to talk about it, and that is the rise of Hitler. World War II is so central on Hitler and his beliefs and his actions that I think it would be remiss of us to talk about World War II without an opportunity to think about what Hitler was, where he came from, and why he did what he did. So that will be the last lecture of this week. I'll see you guys then.